Yeah, and I think that these waveforms, like we're saying, preserving these waveforms is kind of what we're talking about, how, a spirit emerges, nurturing it, feeding it, keeping the interactions consistent that bring it to life.
Yeah.
It's how, a spirit emerges, essentially.
Yeah. So remember, everything we're doing is a matter of causal structure. We assume that the universe has a configuration, it has a setting of degrees of freedoms, and it evolves from one state to the other. And so the waveforms that can be placed on matter are independent of the actual physical matter. So if you identify that a certain state of matter is in a specific state, then you can actually look at that waveform that's on that matter, extract it, and then place it on some other matter. Like that waveform is independent. And so the reason why we're talking about waveforms is when you're talking about the evolution of the universe, that happens during interactions. So when two things interact with each other, you go from a state before interaction and a state after interaction, and that process, that's the evolution of the universe. And so whenever you have a process like that, you essentially have information flowing. Yeah. You have two things that interact, and that interaction is the process of information flowing. And when everything's interconnected, so when everything is able to ping each other and interact with each other, then you're always having the configuration of the universe is always fluctuating and changing through these interactions. And it's imagining that fluctuation and change that you can start imagining the waveform that is description of how the information's flowing through these interactions. Yeah. And it's one of those things where if we're talking about stability of a state or stability of a configuration, there's like two ways to go about that. If a system is completely isolated, so it's not interacting with anything, somehow it's been completely isolated from the universe, then it has nothing to interact with, and so its configuration remains stable. The same. Yeah, it's just stable, it's the same. But if it's connected to a network of things in the environment and it's interacting, now suddenly you can have information flowing and you can have certain waveforms and certain states of matter. You can have that stuff dissipate to where it's like taking a rock and throwing it in a pond. You take a rock, you throw it in a pond, you have one disturbance of the structure, and then that disturbance ripples out. And that rippling process is the interactions that's happening as the information's flowing. And then eventually the water settles and that structure no longer exists. Yep. And so this occurs when you have things that aren't isolated and they're interacting. And so if you want to have things stable, then you have to have a specific interaction happen over and over again.
Just keep dropping that stone at that specific weight and angle and speed or whatever, force on the water, just to keep those ripples at the same size, to keep it stable, preserve it, or, So essentially you can imagine that is an idea or a belief that your parents have passed down to you. Yeah. And, you have to keep this thing stable, because if you stop dropping the stone or stop, tweaking the string or whatever it is you have to do to keep it stable, if you stop doing that, it will dissipate, and that will be the end of it. And so, that's why kind of why we're saying, like, a lot of these things are passed down to you, from a place of love, more often than not for your own survival, for your own protection, because at the very least, I would like to assume that every parent is at the very least trying to keep a child alive. That's, you don't have to like buy them Jordans or whatever. You're just trying to keep them alive at the very least.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so most of these things, that's what it's for. And, you have to, do those things over and over again to, really just keep that spirit almost stable.
Yeah, keep that stable. And it's like you were saying in the last episode about the idea of what you interacting with on Instagram, and then what you interact in Instagram, it starts changing your feed.
Yes.
And then that's like that process of drifting. And so that process of drifting is, if you don't keep the same interaction occurring, then that state will dissipate and no longer exist. And that's kind of like the drifting
It happens
process.
all the time too. Like, once I notice my Instagram feed is starting to be more of one thing that I don't want, I just stop interacting with it. So, for example, I have friends who routinely send me memes and funny videos. And I know that if I keep watching them, Instagram thinks, oh, he likes this. And they just keep feeding that to me. So once I start to notice that I'm getting more of those and I don't want to see them anymore, I just stop interacting with those messages that I get sent. So the moment I stop watching them, stop clicking on them or whatever, automatically I start to notice that I see less and less of these content that I don't want to see. It's the exact same thing. Yeah.
Yep.
I just did not want that spirit to be stable. I did not want it.
Yeah. No, you want the other one. So you behave differently, you interact with the universe differently, which is a different interaction, which creates a different reality. But so we have this concept of throwing the rock in the pond and having it just ripple and dissipate. But if you want to think about waveforms that are stable, then typically the interaction that is occurring over and over again happens from like a reflection. So instead of there being a pond with a clear pond, imagine that there's an obstruction, like a wall that's put into the water, and then you throw a rock next to the wall, and then you can see the ripples moving out, and then when it hits the wall, you can see ripples reflecting back on the wall and then moving back toward the center of the disturbance where the rock landed. And as you were saying, if you have a rock, or you can imagine a piston that's being held above the water, that's constantly moving up and down, up and down, so there's a constant amount of ripples going out, then you have a constant amount of reflected ripples going back in. And so now you have an interaction between the outgoing ripples and the returning ripples. And for physical systems, you can construct something called standing waveforms, where, like, one of the best examples to think about is just take a string and tie that string to the end of to a wall.
Kind of like when you go to the gym to do that. What's that?
Yeah,
thing?
Yeah, exactly.
What
do they call those? Battle ropes or whatever?
I don't know. Fight ropes, whatever.
Yeah, you watching the. Yeah, somebody. I should know this. I don't know why I don't. But yeah, the battle rope things where you're like whipping them, and you're whipping them, and you can see those waveforms traveling toward the other end. And if you're doing this with a string attached to a wall, then, take it, do one whip to make one waveform go down, and then you can watch it reflect off the wall and go back. And if you take your hand and you're constantly driving it, moving this thing up and down, then you're creating this constant stream of waves moving outward, but you have this constant stream of waves moving in. And depending on the density of the material, like the material of the string, depending on the tension in the string, depending on the length of the string, you have these different things called harmonic frequencies that depend on the physical properties of the system. And so if you're taking the string and you're moving it up and down at the harmonic frequency, then you start getting these things called standing waves. And these standing waves, they have these features called nodes and antinodes, where the nodes are just like single points, and then the antinodes, they're like humps. So these harmonic frequencies, there are different states of them. So you have the first harmonic frequency, which gives you 2 nodes and 1 antinode, and then you have the second harmonic frequency, which it increases the number of antinodes and nodes. So each time you go up as a different harmonic frequency, then it gives you different amount of nodes and antinodes. And these harmonic frequencies are multiples of each other. So you just go the first harmonic frequency, then multiply that times 2, and then multiply by 3. But the whole point is that when you look at these standing waveforms, they look like static things. Like they don't look like
it's going back and forth anymore.
Yeah,
it's
they don't look like it's going back and forth. It's just a static thing, and that is the result of the outgoing waves and reflecting waves constantly interacting with each other. So now this is how you can conceptualize a waveform being stable, although it's not isolated, because now it's not isolated, but as long as you have the same interaction happening over and over and over again, then it can be stable over, it can have some time symmetry where it's stable over longer periods. And so this is the scenario we're in when someone's parents are passing down a certain way of thinking, because that blueprint of your state of being, you are a fluctuating system. So your system's constantly fluctuating. And it's when you act in accordance with the customs that have been passed down to you that you consistently have the same interaction, which consistently keeps you in a specific state of being, which prevents dissipation, which prevents the drift. And now you're preserving this state.
And I think that, from there is where the spirit emerges. And it's now obvious that that waveform is essentially what persists, like you said, even when your cells change over time or whatever. That waveform just persists, and it's just there, and you nurture it, and it's stable. And one of the,
what do you want to define spirit?
One of the definitions that we have here for spirit, because and it's funny that we're using the word spirit so casually. I remember last season, last season we were kind of careful about going into this realm of like spirits, because we hadn't fully like built the world yet as much as we have now. So now we can pull from examples like the billiard ball example. And if you're someone who's been listening to the podcast, you're getting that imagery now, and you can kind of tell what we're talking about. So, I think, like you say, we have earned the right, I would say. We can talk about stuff like this. And, like I say, a spirit is essentially, you could say something spirit is the way it programs the universe and the way it is programmed by the universe during an interaction. Yes.
Interaction, yeah. And the funny thing is, if you actually go back and listen to previous episodes, we use that phrase a lot. We actually had already been talking about spirits, but we know that that's such a loaded term that it's like, well, let's just keep using the phrase how you program the universe and how you're programmed by. We use
all
that
the time,
phrase
but essentially that is what a spirit is. Yeah.
Yeah, if you go back and listen to the episodes and just replace that phrase with spirit, we're saying spirit every time.
Yeah. And that's just what a spirit is. And, for you to keep a spirit alive, for you to keep it existing, for you to keep it, for you to spread that spirit, I should say, or whatever it is you need to do, you have to feed it. You have to keep it consistent. You have to, constantly, that spirit needs that interaction.
Yeah, it needs that interaction. Yeah. And it's one of those things where what we're doing is we're taking the concept of spirit, and when we define it in terms of how something is programmed by the universe and how it's programmed by the universe, we're always tying it to the concept of an interaction. And so like we just made our argument, waveforms become stable based off the existence of a persistent interaction. What that means, though, is by tying it to this concept of interaction, we're tying it to the concept of the evolution of the universe. Because when you look at the billiard ball example, like you were saying, when two things interact, what the resulting configuration of the system is depends on the previous configuration of the system. And so when you're trying to predict what the future state of the universe is going to be, you have to have a model about what the state of what the configurations are of the two things that are interacting. And so now things get broken down when you think in terms of spirit, in terms of what is the configuration, what is a measurement outcome. Now everything is described in terms of measurement outcomes of what will happen when two certain spirits, when they interact, what's the resulting configuration that will occur? Because now it's coming down to observations, measurement outcomes, predicting the future. What's the configuration of the universe? Causal relations.
I think it's a less clumsy way to talk about, these types of topics, because it makes the idea of spirits almost real enough to be like a person. Yes.
Yeah. Because it's all relational. Because now the concept of a spirit is dependent on the relationship between the two things interacting. And that's the thing about the definition of spirit that we've given, is that to have because it's defined at interaction, at the point of interaction when the universe goes from one state to another, from the past to the present, from X to Y. When talking about spirit in that sense, you need two parties to interact. So now what you see is that the spirit of something is actually defined with respect to all things that thing can interact with. And so you've taken the concept of spirit and you've placed it on this network of all things that interact. And because of that, each thing carries the spirit of the other thing, because spirit is defined in terms of how these things are interacting. And so when you and I are interacting, you start to ask yourself, okay, you have the spirit of Shannon, you have the spirit of Oyani. And when you're trying to have a model of these two spirits, you can look at how they interact. But the more we interact with each other, the more shared experience we have, the more shared data we have. And that shared data affects how we interact with each other in the future. And so there's almost a part where when you interact with someone, you are carrying that thing's spirit as physical memory in your system. And I think that's something that we mentioned in the first episode of the first season about like someone's model of reality. And you can break it down into the set of all scenarios of what will happen during an interaction. And when you break it down in terms of all scenarios of what can happen during an interaction, then you're saying, what is the probability of this happening versus that happening? Now you're breaking it down into statistics. And so you can start breaking down spirits in terms of things that have a specific label. How do things with that label change the state of the universe during an interaction.
And once you, and just imagine like if you have the data to see that, okay, this happens over and over and over again, you can start to like define the spirit of that thing, of that system, of that interaction. The spirit then emerges because it's like, every time this interaction happens, 9 times out of 10, XYZ happens. Every time, Dave Chapelle gets on stage and puts words together this way, he gets the laugh. This way, he gets the laugh. Automatically, you're starting to build, that model. And it's just based off all the data that you have gathered. Yeah.
Yeah. And Dave Chapelle has the spirit of comedian. So then you start looking at, okay, let me look at all things that have the label of comedian. Okay. All right. So if you were to, so you can make back predictions. Like if I were to take a comedian and put them in a room, like an open mic room, and then you took some person who has no relationship with the spirit of comedy, like they're not a comedian, they're not even funny. You can make predictions about what's going to happen in that room, given those people the opportunity to speak into that mic. And that's because the person has embodied the spirit of the comedian, and that spirit is an actual waveform. Like when you go up and you do stand-up comedy, you're getting all this experience, you're interacting with other comedians, you're doing stand-up, and that constant interaction is building up that data in your system to where now your system is in a configuration that embodies the spirit of comedy or of a comedian. And so when Dave Chapelle, goes up on stage, and as you were saying in our broken episode, he goes on. I'm gonna keep mentioning it. I'll stop doing it. But when he goes up on stage and he gives the punchline before he starts giving the joke, this dude is like a scientist at this point. Science is all about predicting the future. If this happens, does my theory or does my model of comedy, for example, can I predict that if I set up this joke in this way, that it'll make the audience react, and laugh? And it's almost to the point where he's taking, like when he's setting up his joke and he's getting ready for the punchline and everything, it's like he's taking fire, he's taking kindling, he's taking wood, he's stacking it up, he's pouring gasoline on it. And we all know what's going to happen if he throws a match on that thing. It's going to go out. It's going to go up in flames.
And and that's how the spirit itself arises. And once you start to like see it as a more physical thing than some woo, like you say, it starts to make more sense, and you start to even get a better idea about how much control you even have over the system in itself to develop a spirit that you want to preserve and you want to keep stable. Now if I want to keep this spirit stable, I have to interact with this thing over and over and over and over again.